All right, so let me just dive straight into how things went down. I was 10 when my parents split up, and to say I didn't handle it well would be a massive understatement. I mean, what kid is going to take something like that well? But for me, it hit hard. Real hard. Looking back, I guess they just fell out of love or whatever. But at the time, all I could see was that the two people I relied on the most suddenly didn't want to be together anymore. I remember being confused and angry all the time, lashing out at both of them, mostly at my dad, though. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like he was the one responsible for ruining everything. We went through the motions, counseling and all that, but if I'm honest, it was a waste of time. My mom was the only one who seemed like she was really trying to get me or where I was coming from. My dad, on the other hand, had this suck it up attitude about everything. He didn't get how much I was hurting, and if I'm being real, I don't think he cared. He was more focused on keeping it all together for himself than thinking about what I was going through. I don't know, maybe that's just how he deals with stuff. We never really connected much after that, and it felt like we were just two strangers living in the same house. I stayed mostly with my mom, which was fine by me because we were always closer. I only went to my dad's place on weekends or for short breaks. Not gonna lie, I kinda dreaded those weekends. It was awkward, and I didn't feel like I belonged there anymore. But things took a turn when I was about 14. That's when my mom decided to remarry. Now, don't get me wrong, I wanted her to be happy. But her new husband, let's just call him Mike, wasn't exactly thrilled about having me around. I don't know if it was me or if he just didn't want a kid who wasn't his own in his life, but the vibes were clear. I wasn't welcome. And then, just like that, my mom made a choice. She picked her new life with him over me. I can't even begin to describe how that felt. It was like one moment she was my rock, the only one who understood me, and the next she was pushing me out of her life. She told me it was for the best, and that I should live with my dad. Yeah, right. For her best, maybe. I was crushed. I felt abandoned. Like, how do you go from being the center of someone's world to being shoved aside because their new husband doesn't want to deal with you? It didn't make sense to me then, and honestly, it still doesn't now. So, I packed up and moved in with my dad and his fiancée, Olivia. Now, Olivia was a piece of work. She'd been with my dad for a while at that point, and she had this weird idea that she could just step in and be my mom or something. I wasn't having any of that. I was still reeling from being ditched by my actual mom, and here's this woman trying to act like everything was normal. I shut that down quick. I didn't need or want another mom, especially not one who didn't get me or my situation. My dad, of course, didn't really notice or care about how I was feeling. He was too busy playing happy family with Olivia to realize that I was struggling. To him, it was like I should just get over it, move on, and adjust to the new family dynamic. But how the hell was I supposed to adjust when my life had been turned upside down? Living with them sucked, plain and simple. Every day felt like I was just trying to survive in a place where I didn't belong. Olivia was always hovering, trying to get me to open up to her or do things as a family. I wasn't interested. The more she pushed, the more I pulled back. And my dad? He acted like everything was fine. Like me being there was no big deal. Meanwhile, I was grieving the fact that my mom had basically ditched me for a guy who couldn't stand the sight of me. There were times when I thought about running away, just leaving and seeing where I ended up. It was that bad. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed, kept my head down, and counted the days until I could get out for good. I threw myself into school, focused on getting into college, and planned my escape that way. I figured if I could just make it to college, I'd be free. All right, so I made it through high school without completely losing my mind, but living with Olivia and my dad was rough. Every day was just tension. Like, there was no big blow up or anything, but it was always there, That feeling that I wasn't wanted. Olivia wasn't mean to me outright, but she had this way of making me feel like I was just in the way, like everything would have been easier if I wasn't around. She never said it, but I could feel it. And then there was Jess, her daughter. Now, Jess wasn't the issue at first. She was all right, we weren't close, but she wasn't a total brat or anything. It was just awkward, because Olivia would constantly go out of her way to make sure Jess was the center of everything. Like, Jess got special treatment for everything. Olivia was constantly pulling strings to make her life easier. Sports teams, school plays, whatever Jess wanted, Olivia would make it happen. And Jess? She kind of just went along with it. She wasn't exactly spoiled rotten, but she didn't push back either. She just accepted that her mom was going to smooth everything over for her no matter what. Meanwhile, I was just in the background trying to stay out of the way and not cause any drama. Living with them was like living in someone else's home. My dad had his own life with Olivia, and I was just there. I mean, sure, I had a room, but it never felt like mine. It was more like a guest room where they just let me crash. I tried to keep busy with school and avoided being home as much as possible. I'd hang out at friends' places or stay late at the library, basically doing anything to not deal with being at the house. But then things started to get complicated when Jess started acting weird. It was like, overnight, she went from just being Olivia's daughter, who I tolerated, to this person who was constantly hovering around whenever I brought someone over, especially when it was Ethan. Yeah, I know I haven't mentioned him yet, but this is where he comes into the picture. So Ethan and I started dating when I was in college. We were both studying at USC, and things were going well between us. He's a good guy, and I really liked him. Naturally, I started bringing him over to my dad's house sometimes, and at first, it was fine. But then, out of nowhere, Jess started acting all weird around him. Like, she'd get super shy and quiet, which wasn't her usual vibe at all. At first, I didn't think too much of it. I just figured maybe she was having a bad day or whatever, but it didn't stop. Every time Ethan came over, Jess would be all flustered like a middle schooler with a crush. She'd hang around when we were trying to talk, asking him random questions, and just being there. It started to get really awkward, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. I figured it'd blow over eventually, right? Wrong. It only got worse. Jess was straight up obsessed with Ethan. She started making excuses to be in the same room as us, or she'd just randomly show up when we were hanging out. I even caught her staring at him a few times. It was super uncomfortable, and I didn't know how to handle it at first. I mean, what was I supposed to do? Tell my dad that his fiance's daughter had a crush on my boyfriend? That wouldn't end well, and I knew it. So I tried to handle it myself. I pulled Jess aside one day and straight up asked her if she had feelings for Ethan. She looked like she wanted the ground to swallow her up, but she didn't deny it. She didn't even say anything, just kind of nodded and avoided eye contact. I told her that this was really weird and awkward for me, and she needed to back off. I thought that would be enough to put an end to it, but nope. If anything, it got worse. Jess started acting all dramatic after that. Her grades slipped, and she was moping around the house like she was heartbroken. I'd hear her crying in her room at night, and Olivia, being Olivia, noticed. Of course, she had to get involved. Instead of talking to Jess like a normal parent, Olivia decided that it was somehow my fault that Jess was a mess. She cornered me one day in the kitchen and accused me of flaunting my relationship with Ethan to make Jess feel bad. Like, seriously? How was it my fault that Jess had a crush on my boyfriend? It was ridiculous. But Olivia was dead serious. She told me I needed to be more considerate and suggested that maybe I shouldn't bring Ethan around anymore, for Jess's sake. Yeah, no, that wasn't happening. I told her flat out that I wasn't going to stop seeing Ethan just because Jess had a thing for him. If anything, Jess needed to learn how to deal with her feelings like an adult, not expect me to bend over backward to make her feel better. Olivia didn't like that answer, and she went straight to my dad about it. Now, my dad's always been the kind of guy who avoids conflict, so of course, he tried to play peacemaker. He sat me down one night and gave me this whole speech about how I needed to be more understanding and that maybe I should take a break from seeing Ethan for a while. You know, for the sake of the family. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My dad was seriously suggesting I break up with my boyfriend just because Jess had a crush on him? I laughed in his face. I didn't mean to, but it was so ridiculous I couldn't help it. I told him there was no way I was ending my relationship just because Olivia and Jess couldn't handle their feelings. That conversation turned into a massive argument. My dad kept going on about how I needed to think of Jess's feelings and how I was making things harder for everyone. I just kept telling him that it wasn't my problem. I wasn't going to change my life to make things easier for them. If Jess couldn't handle seeing Ethan around, that was on her, not me. By the end of it, it was clear that things weren't going to get any better. My dad was siding with Olivia, and I wasn't going to give in to their demands. The tension in the house was unbearable after that. I couldn't even look at Jess without feeling angry, and every time Olivia opened her mouth, it was just to make passive-aggressive comments about how hard things were for Jess. I knew then that I couldn't stay there much longer. This wasn't my home anymore. And honestly, I didn't think it ever really was. My dad had chosen his new life with Olivia and Jess, and I was just an outsider. I needed to get out, and fast. So yeah, that's how things went downhill with Jess, Olivia, and my dad. It was like everything was building up to that moment, and once it hit, there was no going back. I was done. Done with the drama, done with the feeling of not belonging. It was time to make a move, and I knew I had to do it soon. So, after that whole mess with Jess and Olivia, things at my dad's house just kept getting worse. I was basically living in a pressure cooker, waiting for the next explosion. Every day felt tense and awkward. If I wasn't at school, I tried to be anywhere but home. It was just getting unbearable. But then things hit a new level of crazy, and that's when I realized I had to get out for real. I guess I should have seen it coming, but it still threw me. One night, my dad asked me to sit down and have a family meeting. Now, if you've ever been in a dysfunctional family, you know that those words usually mean bad news. I wasn't looking forward to it, but I figured, fine, let's get this over with. We all sat down in the living room. Me, my dad, Olivia, and Jess. And honestly, from the looks on their faces, I knew this was going to be some sort of intervention. My dad started off with this whole speech about how the tension in the house was affecting everyone, how we all needed to figure out a way to get along better. I didn't say anything, just nodded along, waiting for him to get to the point. Then Olivia jumps in. She starts talking about how Jess has been struggling lately, which I already knew, and that the situation with Ethan wasn't helping. And I'm just sitting there thinking, great, here we go again. But instead of going down the usual path of blaming me, she drops this bomb on me. We think it would be best if you took a break from seeing Ethan for a while. I swear I almost laughed again. Like, seriously? This again? But she wasn't done. Olivia went on to explain that Jess needed time to process her emotions and that my relationship with Ethan was distracting her from focusing on her own life. She made it sound like I was causing Jess to fail at school or something, which was total BS. At that point, I couldn't hold back. I just said, "You can't be serious. You want me to put my life on hold because Jess has a crush on my boyfriend? How is that my problem?" Olivia didn't like that at all. She got this tight look on her face, and my dad jumped in to back her up, saying that they weren't asking me to break up with Ethan, just to give things some space. I told them flat out that it wasn't happening. There was no way I was going to stop seeing Ethan just because Jess couldn't handle it. If she had a problem, she needed to deal with it, not make it everyone else's issue. The room went dead silent after that. You could cut the tension with a knife. Jess, who had been staring at the floor the whole time, suddenly looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean for it to get this bad." I wasn't expecting that. I mean, I knew Jess had a thing for Ethan, but seeing her like that, so genuinely upset, made me pause for a second. But then Olivia jumped back in, twisting the knife by saying, "We just want what's best for everyone, especially for Jess. We all need to make sacrifices sometimes for the good of the family." At that point, I'd had enough. "Sacrifices?" I snapped. "What have you sacrificed, Olivia? All I've done since I moved in here is try to stay out of your way. I've given up enough. I'm not giving up Ethan, too." My dad didn't say anything for a long moment. He just sat there, looking tired and defeated, like he didn't even want to be part of this conversation anymore. Finally, he sighed and said, "We're just trying to make things work, that's all. We don't want to force you to do anything, but we can't keep living with this tension." I stared at him, wondering how he couldn't see how messed up this whole situation was. I'd always known he wasn't the best at handling emotions, but this was a whole new level of avoidance. Instead of dealing with the real problem, they were all just putting the blame on me. I stood up, and that's when I said it. "I can't do this anymore. I'm done." The words just came out, but as soon as I said them, I knew it was the truth. I couldn't stay there any longer. Living with them wasn't healthy. It was making me angry and resentful, and I deserved better than that. I didn't know where I was going to go or how I was going to make it work, but I couldn't stay there. Olivia looked at my dad, like she couldn't believe I'd actually said it. Jess just sat there, her face crumpled in on itself, looking miserable. And my dad? He didn't even try to stop me. He just nodded, like he expected it. Then my dad said, "If you don't break up with Ethan, I can't let you live here." "Fine," I said. "I'll be out by the end of the week." And that was that. I left the room, went to my room, and started packing. I didn't even know where I was going, but I started putting stuff into boxes anyway. Part of me was angry, but another part of me just felt relieved. I didn't have to deal with their crap anymore. I could just walk away and leave it all behind. Over the next couple of days, I packed up everything I owned. I barely spoke to anyone in the house. Olivia acted like she didn't care, and Jess kept to herself, probably embarrassed about the whole thing. My dad tried to talk to me once, but it was just more of the same. Him trying to make peace without actually fixing anything. I didn't tell him where I was going when I left. I didn't think he even cared. The day I moved out, I loaded up my car, looked back at the house one last time, and then I drove off. I didn't look back. Leaving wasn't easy. I was scared and uncertain about what would happen next, but I also knew that staying in that house wasn't an option anymore. My dad had made his choice. He'd chosen his new family over me, and I wasn't going to stick around and be a second thought in my own life. I didn't really know what the future held for me, but I knew one thing for sure. I was done with the toxic mess my life had become in that house. It was time to figure out who I was and what I wanted without them dragging me down. It was time to start living for me, not for them. So, after I left my dad's house, it was like a weird mix of relief and straight up panic. I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't have a solid plan or anywhere permanent to stay right away, but I knew I couldn't stay in that toxic mess any longer. It was like getting out of a pressure cooker. Yeah, things were calm for a minute, but now I had to figure out how to survive on my own. At first, I crashed at my friend Kayla's place. She had this tiny apartment not too far from campus, and she was cool enough to let me stay with her for a while. I didn't want to be a burden, so I told her it was temporary, just until I figured things out. I started looking for a job immediately. Even though I was still in school, I knew I had to start making money if I was going to pay for rent and all that. Those first few weeks were rough. I was working random shifts at a 24-hour diner, mostly late nights and weekends. I didn't have much choice. I needed the money. It wasn't the best job in the world, but it paid enough to keep me afloat. Between working, going to class, and studying, I barely had time to think. And honestly, that was probably for the best. But every now and then, when I had a quiet moment, I'd start thinking about everything that had happened with my family. It was hard not to feel angry and a little lost. I mean, I knew I made the right choice by leaving, but that didn't make it any easier to accept that my dad had chosen Olivia and Jess over me. It stung. Bad. It felt like I wasn't even part of his life anymore, like I'd been replaced. The worst part? He didn't even reach out after I left. Not a single phone call or text to see if I was okay. It was like I just disappeared, and he didn't care enough to check. That hurt more than I wanted to admit, but I was trying not to dwell on it too much. I had to focus on building my own life now, without relying on him. After about a month of couch surfing at Kayla's, I finally found a tiny studio apartment that I could afford. It wasn't much, just a small room with a bathroom and a kitchenette, but it was mine. It felt good to have my own space, somewhere I didn't have to walk on eggshells all the time. The first night I slept there, I remember just lying on the floor, since I didn't have any furniture yet, feeling this huge wave of relief. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could actually breathe. But of course, life wasn't going to let me off that easy. About 2 weeks after I moved in, I got a text from my dad. It was short and cold, like he was writing an email to a coworker or something. He said something like, "Hope you're doing well. Let me know when you have time to talk." That was it. No apology. No, "I miss you." Nothing. Just a sterile message that felt more like an obligation than him actually wanting to talk. I stared at the message for a long time, trying to figure out how I felt about it. Part of me wanted to reply, to open up some kind of dialogue and maybe, just maybe, fix things. But the other part of me, the part that was still pissed off and hurt, wanted to just ignore him. Why should I be the one to reach out when he hadn't bothered to check on me in weeks? Why should I care when he clearly didn't? In the end, I didn't respond. I just couldn't. It wasn't about being petty or trying to punish him. It was more like, what was the point? What could we possibly say to each other that would fix everything? I wasn't ready to go back to that mess, and honestly, I didn't know if I ever would be. Instead, I threw myself into work and school. I was grinding nonstop, doing whatever I could to keep moving forward. It wasn't easy, but it felt good to be doing something for myself for once. I wasn't living under anyone's roof or dealing with their drama. This was my life now, and I was determined to make it work. Ethan was a huge support during this time. He never pressured me about the whole family situation, but he was there when I needed someone to vent to or just to hang out and distract me from everything. He'd come over to my new place after his classes, and we'd sit on the floor, still no furniture by the way, and just talk about anything but my family. It was nice to have someone who got me without all the baggage attached. But despite trying to move on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. No matter how much I tried to ignore it, the whole thing with my dad weighed on me. I hated that I still cared. I hated that part of me wanted him to call or show up at my door, apologizing for everything and asking me to come back. But that wasn't going to happen, and deep down, I knew it. Weeks turned into months, and eventually, I got into a routine. The diner job wasn't great, but it paid the bills, and I was managing to keep up with school. Kayla and I stayed close, and Ethan was still by my side. I was starting to feel like I had some control over my life again. But every now and then, when I was alone in that quiet apartment, I'd get this nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Like, what if I'd made a mistake? What if cutting off my dad wasn't the right move? I kept telling myself that I did what I had to do, that I couldn't stay in that toxic environment. And yeah, that was true. But still, it's not easy walking away from your family no matter how bad things get. There's always that little voice in your head wondering if there was another way, if maybe things could have been different. But I pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on the fact that I was finally in control of my own life. I didn't have to answer to anyone but myself, and that was a freedom I hadn't felt in years. And even though it was hard, I knew I'd made the right choice. So that's where I was, living in my tiny apartment, working long shifts, and trying to figure out what my next move was. I hadn't heard from my dad or Olivia since that text, and honestly, I was okay with that. I was starting to build something for myself, and that felt pretty damn good. All right, so things got messy after I left, but what really surprised me was how bad it got for them. I didn't expect their lives to fall apart like they did. It's almost like karma was just waiting for the right moment to come down hard on them. A few months after I had fully cut ties with my dad, Olivia, and Jess, I started hearing bits and pieces about what was going on with them. I wasn't trying to keep tabs on them or anything, but mutual friends and old neighbors would drop little tidbits in conversations. And from what I heard, their perfect life was slowly unraveling. It started small, arguments between my dad and Olivia, tensions at home, but eventually, things spiraled. Turns out, after I left, Jess really went off the rails. She wasn't just sulking over her unrequited crush on Ethan like she had been before. No, she fully spiraled. She dropped out of college not long after I moved out. At first, it seemed like she was just taking a break, but the truth was, she couldn't handle the pressure. Without Olivia constantly smoothing things over for her, Jess was left to deal with real life, and she couldn't do it. She started hanging out with the wrong crowd, getting into trouble. It got bad enough that Olivia, who once coddled Jess like she was made of glass, couldn't even control her anymore. And that's when things at home went from tense to chaotic. Olivia was freaking out because her perfect little girl was slipping through her fingers, and my dad? He was caught in the middle, trying to keep the peace like he always did. But this time it wasn't working. I heard that Jess ended up getting arrested. Twice. The first time was for shoplifting, and Olivia managed to get her out of it, pulling some strings with one of her lawyer friends. But the second time, it was worse. Apparently, Jess had been caught with some drugs at a party, and there was no quick fix for that. She was facing real charges, and Olivia couldn't just throw money at the problem to make it go away. From what I was told, this was the final straw for my dad. He had already been on edge dealing with Olivia's control issues and Jess's breakdown. But now, with legal problems and their reputations on the line, he snapped. They were constantly fighting. I mean, screaming matches, doors slamming, the works. And the thing is, Olivia had no one to blame but herself. She created this mess, but instead of admitting that, she tried to pin it on my dad, saying he wasn't supportive enough or that he wasn't leading the family. Classic deflection. Then there was the financial disaster. I found out through some old neighbors that my dad had made some bad investments after getting pressured by Olivia to expand their wealth. Olivia had always been obsessed with status, having the nicest house, the newest car, and of course being better than my mom ever was. She pushed my dad to invest in some sketchy real estate deal thinking they'd make a quick profit. Spoiler alert, it didn't work out. They lost a lot of money. Like, we're talking almost all of my dad's savings. The house they were living in, they were on the verge of losing it. Olivia had spent years pretending they were living the high life, and now it was all crumbling down around them. My dad, who had worked his whole life to build some kind of stability, was now facing the possibility of having nothing. And guess what? Olivia bailed. Yep, when things got too tough for her, she packed her bags and left. She wasn't about to stick around and deal with the consequences of the mess she helped create. From what I heard, she ran off with some guy who had more money, someone she met through one of her fancy social circles. It was typical Olivia, always chasing the next best thing, never sticking around when things got hard. So there was my dad, left with nothing. His wife had left him, his daughter was in serious legal trouble, and he was drowning in debt. I remember thinking, well, this is what happens when you pick the wrong side. And yeah, maybe that sounds harsh, but I couldn't feel bad for him. Not after everything he'd put me through. Then, out of nowhere, I got a text from my dad. It wasn't like the cold, business-like messages from before. This one had some desperation in it. He asked if we could talk. Said he needed to explain everything. I didn't respond right away. I mean, what was there to talk about? He chose Olivia and her perfect little life over me. And now that it was all falling apart, he wanted to reconnect. I wasn't interested in playing savior for him. But a week later, I got another text, and this one hit harder. He was asking for help. Financial help. Can you believe that? After everything that happened, he had the nerve to ask me for money. Said he was in a tough spot and that he didn't know where else to turn. I stared at that message for a long time, just trying to wrap my head around it. I guess that was his last play. Olivia was gone, Jess was a wreck, and now he was broke. The guy who had never really been there for me, who chose his new family over his own daughter, was asking for a lifeline. It was hard to believe, but at the same time, I wasn't shocked. When you build your life on someone else's terms, it falls apart just as easily. I didn't respond. I couldn't. There was nothing left to say. He made his choices, and now he had to live with them. It was kind of poetic in a way. The perfect little life he built around Olivia had crumbled, and now he was left standing in the ruins. Meanwhile, I was doing just fine. I had my own place, my own life, and I didn't need him anymore. That's the thing about karma. It doesn't care how long it takes. It just waits for the right moment to show up. And when it does, it doesn't hold back.